I'm going to give a little presentation a little bit different from last year about sort of, I guess it's a marketing forum, so I'll talk about marketing in the age of Web3 and digital property rights and how it's changed for everyone in the space and how it will change, we think. And just before we go even to this topic, Web3 has gone a little bit through a rough patch in the last year. Crypto and blockchain has had some reputational issues, but there is still a $1 trillion market in the Web3 space and is creating a lot more adoption in the space than people might imagine. So it's not one to ignore. But let me explain that first. Just a little primer first. You already know this, but it's probably worth going after. Web 1 was the web of read back in the early sort of 90s going all the way to the early 2000s, where basically we were just going on the browser with Mosaic and Netscape. Web 2 is the era we live in right now. This includes TikTok, Facebook, social media as we know it, basically the kind of platforms where data is written, but the data is written on their platforms. And we have to access these platforms in order to have rights to connect to them. And Web 3, which is the future web, which we believe is the future iteration of the internet, is basically the web of ownership, which means that through blockchain, we actually now have a way in which we can become a stakeholder, an owner basically in the networks that we help construct. Let me sort of maybe illustrate that in sort of a mental model. Imagine if you're sharing a photo on Instagram. The idea basically would be that in a Web3 model of Instagram, every time you share a photo, you become a small stakeholder through a tokenization framework. It means you become almost like a shareholder in it. And it may not be a very big portion, but you basically retain and gain equity in the networks that you help construct. That's basically the principle of Web3. And it changes it from company-owned internet platforms to community-owned internet platforms. And that's basically the basis of blockchain. Ethereum is a community-based network. Bitcoin is a community-based network. Sandbox is a community-based network. Right? That's basically the underlying principle, changing it basically to a kind of stakeholder capitalism. So what does it really mean? Well, what it means, before I go into some examples, is that in Web3, the incentives are aligned across the network. In a traditional, sort of as you see as marketers, the value tends to go predominantly to the owners or the investors in the Web3, in the Web2 paradigm. For instance, Facebook shareholders and Facebook the company get most of the value. Or for instance, Spotify, Spotify investors, Spotify sort of management, they get most of the value. But the creators who make the asset actually don't receive that much value in Web 2. They're not the ones who actually gain anything from it, even though they provide all the value. So in Web 3, what happens is the value is distributed between all of them because they all essentially become stakeholders in that network. So let me give you some examples exactly how that would work. So one example is, for instance, with NFTs. And aside from sort of the whole story about what happened with NFTs, stakeholder alignment through ownership is an example of this. I'll give you an example, for instance, with Bored Apes. Bored Apes today, still at around 30 ETH, so we're talking about maybe $50,000, $60,000 per NFT, but that's not what it cost at the time to buy it. At the time, the cost was only hundreds of dollars. But what happened was that Yuga Labs built their ecosystem by giving essentially a form of ownership through NFTs, where they obtain these IP rights, to the community, and they helped build value together. So in the classic kind of example in IP licensing, what would actually normally happen is you would someone like Disney would hire thousands of people to basically do an IP licensing deal and do above-the-line marketing to create a brand and basically sort of invent a network effect. But actually in Web3, what happens is you could, at ground level, bring in basically all of your customers, as it were, and they become co-owners in your business, and they become the ones who want to promote and grow the business as a result, and because they have a vested interest in it. Again, they become a stakeholder in this. This is also the reason why in Web3 people give sometimes free NFTs. They don't give free NFTs because they just want to give away freebies. That could work as well. They give it away because they want you to become a shareholder in the business of sorts, an equity owner, so that the incentive is aligned to help grow that business. And when that business grows, then actually everyone gets to benefit, and they end up promoting it, and they end up growing it, which explains why, despite the market, Web3 companies accelerate faster and have higher ARPUs. So it changes it from the sort of Web 2 paradigm, which is generally mostly a push kind of marketing, to a much more natural kind of pull marketing in the era of basically stakeholder ownership in Web 3. The other thing in terms of how you can sort of create marketing, from a marketing standpoint, you're actually leveraging network effects. That's ultimately what you're doing. But you're borrowing the network effects basically from a Facebook or an Instagram. And today, a lot of this is algorithmic, for instance. But actually in Web 3, the network effects are inherent in the ownership of these assets and items, as they kind of do in the physical world. So an example, let's say, imagine if, we just sort of, it's a thought experiment, Fortnite, which basically has 70 million users and has their own base by skins, and those skins were actually on chain. Those Web3 assets, they were actually Web3 assets. The way that you would market isn't actually to sort of do sort of traditional marketing promotion. You would basically center around the owners of these assets and basically create a title for them. For instance, someone could open up somewhere else a kind of Fortnite Fashion Week, or someone create a Fortnite racing game, or someone create a Fortnite whatever if they wanted to, because all you now need to do is give utility for the owners of these assets. You don't have to go to APAC and say, am I allowed to do an advertising promotion, for instance, because you go directly to the consumers or the end users, to the owners of these assets. That's basically how it works in Web3, because you have natural network effects. In a Web3 company, they encourage that, because that means the asset goes from having one utility, which would be in one game or in one social network, into having thousands of utility. So the value of the assets increases, and they're able to clip a fee, basically a transaction fee, every time that happens. Basically, the user becomes the platform, as opposed to the product, as it currently is in Web 2 versus Web 3. There's some live examples of this. I really spoke a little bit about Bored Apes, but Bored Apes has thousands of IP license holders. The way this works is when you own the NFT, you basically have all of the sort of IP rights for commercialization embedded by the holding of this one unique Bored Ape. But every Bored Ape is different. They have slightly different designs, but everyone knows when they see one, it's a Bored Ape. What it really means is not only from a licensing standpoint, I can license my Bored Ape, maybe for a movie or for fashion or that kind of stuff, or for water products. What happens is that even though only that ape might become famous, the whole stature, the whole network of the Bored Apes increases as a result of that. And the same is true in Sandbox. If you buy a piece of land in Sandbox and you develop something in that land, every other landowner in Sandbox also gets to enjoy the benefits of the growth in that reputation. So meaning that you get to share in the distributed network effects of this, and they all have an interest in basically helping grow that network. That's basically the way that marketing would work in terms of leveraging these network effects, but more from the ground up, as opposed to basically trying to talk to a top-level organization, doing advertising and promoting it that way. And you can also go directly to the end users directly, as opposed to sort of, again, working through a platform, because the user themselves basically become the platform. So, you know, one of the main reasons why we think Web3, as a result, is just not just much more powerful for sort of, you know, the end users, but also for marketers like yourself, is that because there's a larger and greater share of revenue that's distributed more fairly across, the incentives, as I said earlier, are better aligned. Let me just illustrate that as an example here. Last year, in I guess what you could call the peak of a bear market, NFTs did $24 billion in sales. That's not a bad number for an audience that only has millions of users. But what's important isn't that it was $24 billion. What's important is that 90% of that value went to creators and owners of these NFTs. So it's basically the users who created value in these networks, the co-owners that actually created most of the value. And then the platforms like OpenSea and the marketplaces, they got a good clip. They made billions of dollars too. But most of the value actually went to the users. Whereas in Web 2, Spotify in that same year paid out a little less than $8 billion in that same year. And everyone knows that a musician can't make money being a musician on Spotify. It's a promotion platform. It's a marketing platform, even though all that value basically that is generated for the benefit of Spotify. Again, the example I gave, that the incentives are aligned basically in the wrong way in Web 2, but in Web 3, they're much better aligned, which basically creates the structures that we have today. And again, this is the reason why we think ultimately Web 3 will win, because it's better for creators and for owners of these digital assets, these digital property rights. All right, so I'll close with a few thoughts, a couple more slides quickly before we can go through a little talk. DAOs are important because these represent the future organizations in Web3. Today, there's about $12 to $13 billion locked in these DAOs, and it's increasing, and roughly about 140, 150 organizations. These are not organizations run like corporations. These will be potentially your new customers. We think DAOs will be the next generation of these organizations because they basically are community run. For instance, whether it's Ethereum or whether it's ApeCoin or in the future Sandbox, these are ecosystems that have billions of dollars in their reserves, and they're basically getting community-funded projects. So for instance, someone basically went out and made a proposal to have their ApeCoin be represented at ETH Global, which is an event around the year, and they received $1 million from the foundation. Basically, the users voted on it because they thought it was a benefit. It's a way to do promotion. It's a marketing effect, and they can also sort of fund new projects, new events. These are basically the new ecosystems that you can sort of leverage. And most people don't know that they exist, but they're constantly growing. And the entire space, as I said, in which these DAOs operate is about $1 trillion today. Some ways to do this as well, when you think about something like Mochaverse, which is basically our NFT collection, is you can actually leverage yourself across these different DAOs by operating a kind of DAO of DAOs. Basically, if you own NFTs in an ecosystem, it allows you to actually become members in other ecosystems as well. So kind of a governance system. So that means that you don't necessarily have to buy tokens yourself in that ecosystem to participate. You can also participate in, let's call it the more sort of like master or super PAC organizations that are within that. Again, it's a different kind of marketing yourself through DAOs. So I'm going to close a little bit on gaming, just as sort of another example as to how Web3 marketing works here. We all know gaming is huge, 3.4 billion gamers today, $200 billion, larger than music and movies combined. But I think the one thing to understand about gaming is that it is still dependent on a very low conversion rate, basically between 1% to 3%. So most of you in this room may have played mobile games, but you probably didn't pay for those games, or at least your friends didn't, because it depends really only on a very small percentage of people who pay for that. The other thing that's interesting to note in that $20 billion industry is that gaming is one of the biggest advertisers in the space, which you probably know, and last year spent over $100 billion in basically performance marketing, attracting users, which probably wouldn't surprise you because chances are that when you're sort of browsing through your applications, it's probably one game ad or the other. Now, what that really means is that the game company, outside of paying 30% of its revenue basically to Apple and the platforms, also gives up basically half of the industry's sort of total top line to these platforms. And the difference in Web 2, of course, is that Apple and Facebook and Google and those companies benefit. But how much of that value goes back to the gamers or to the game companies that are basically building these ecosystems? And the answer is, of course, not very much, because it's not within their incentive alignment. Again, so the example here would be, instead of, for instance, doing the typical CPI install or the typical kind of above-the-line marketing to attract an end user into a network that you may not own, that's when people give out, for instance, free NFTs. But what is the point of giving a free NFT? It's essentially saying, I'm giving you something of value to you. I'm spending maybe even the same amount of money that I would in terms of marketing, except now I'm giving you a stake in the network. If you want to sell it, that might be the cost. Or if not, I might become a customer. It means that the end user becomes essentially the beneficiary of the marketing effort as a kind of way of attracting users into it. It becomes a way in which basically the end user who is most interested in the product and the conversion of that user is much higher than the single-digit conversion that you end up getting in the kind of push marketing campaign that you have in the traditional Web 2 space. Because also, there's an authentic belief in that. They went through the effort to claim it. And so you see a lot of these sort of NFT drops, as an example, or token drops as a form of marketing in a way to basically expand their audiences by making them stakeholders in the network, just as you see in things like sort of Bored Apes or Sandbox and so forth. All right, I'll give you a final example, and then I guess we can go to a little Q&A. This is an example of a platform where you combine essentially how marketers get combined with assets in the form of Web3. Teachers today in a platform called TinyTap and Open Campus are able to produce basically learning content, which makes revenue because they sell it to students and others around the world. But by owning the NFT and by selling it to someone, that owner now becomes a co-owner in this and can receive the revenue for that, right? It's the embedment of the contract, the services, contractual rights, IP rights, all in one. So basically, you create a co-ownership between the teacher and the new owner. What we found was interesting is that the new owners of this actually aren't just people who are sort of interested in the financial yield, which is one benefit of Web3, because essentially content becomes a capital asset. But the other benefit, which is that the kind of person who buys it because he thinks he can maybe do more performance. It could be a marketer like yourself, or it could be someone else who says, hey, I see potential with this. I will buy a stake in this, and I'll help improve its value, and we can both share in this. And you can do this now in assets that are only dollars as opposed to real estate, like which just has to be in the millions of dollars, for instance. It actually creates a way in which there's not just co-creation in content, but co-marketing between creators, like teachers who might be very good at making education content, but actually don't really know how to market their products and services. But now there's an incentive layer to do that. In developing countries, like for instance, Venezuela or Philippines, the average income of a teacher is maybe $10 to $15 a month, maybe $20. These people can never retain or obtain any kind of capital formation because there's no banking system for it, and there will never be a contract available where something that might make $20 a month could be sold for $100 or $200 because the whole legal infrastructure and the cost to do so is too expensive. But through the sale of an NFT, the contractual rights, the legal rights, and all where the money flows can be done in a transaction that is less than $1. It means that you can now create capital formation and the benefits of these examples of ownership with things that are only worth sort of few dollars, which we think will create a major emerging market, basically in the places that would typically be unbanked as a result of Web3. All right, so I'll leave it with that and pass it on to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Evelina. I'm thrilled to be invited to be having this conversation with you today. Yat and I connected over the weekend, and we had a bit of a giggle because it's not gone unnoticed between the two of us that Jasper and the branded crew love creating a bit of dynamic tension on stage. Given that I work for Meta and I lead the creator marketing efforts in the region, so I'm part of the organization that is in the hot seat today. But however, I also do run a Web3 community alongside 5 other co-founders. So yeah, for the purpose of this moderation, think of me as Switzerland. Feel free to share openly, uncensored, unfiltered. So you talk there a lot about ownership, which is incredibly important for Web3, and it's this promise which motivates a lot of the people that have decided to work in the industry. So you've got the decentralization of data from large companies and digital sovereignty as the foundational principles of the idea. So bringing it back to marketing and for everyone in the room, how do you see these concepts playing out in this new world in Web3 marketing between brands and consumers? And what's the opportunity here for marketers right now?
Well, I mean, I think the most obvious effect is the effect of ownership. The effect of ownership isn't just the idea that you own something, it's the loyalty that comes with ownership. Just think about the difference between what it feels like when you're renting a piece of property versus when you own a piece of property. It's not that the return of that property comes out in the first year. In some places, in some markets, sometimes it does, but most of the time that's not why you do it. But because you own it, you invest in it, you promote it, you talk about it, you fall in love with it, right? These are things that actually form a part of who we are. If you could never own something, truly own something, then actually there's not even a point in investing in it. You also don't have the benefits of capital formation, and all the network effects around won't be able to be built because you have to seek permission. And I think this is the biggest difference between Web 2 and Web 3. Think of all the businesses that have basically built apps or built applications on top of Twitter or Apple or Facebook, and then the platform says, actually, we don't like you, right? And they just remove you. Most recent example, the person who owned the @music handle on the renamed X lost the handle because basically Elon decided he wanted to enter the music business. And we don't know whether he was paid anything, but he certainly complained about it bitterly with his new handle. And the owner of the @X handle also lost it because essentially he doesn't own any rights in it. So how can he invest in something? And from a marketer standpoint, you know, it's not just the effects of what you do for the clients, it's also how much people are willing to invest back into you. If I invest in something that I know I can own for the long term, I'm willing to invest more. There will be larger marketing dollars, there'll be larger investments. But if I know this is a business that might go away at any time, you can't do that. And we see this effect in countries that have very strong property rights, basically, and where it's protected, have the stability base to basically have large GDPs and basically large economies. And the kind of countries on the extreme side, like North Korea, basically have no property rights and nobody can invest in anything because there's no safety and security around that.
Right. Fascinating. I think that's why the whole notion of Web3 is such a cultural shift. That really does motivate so many people to get into the industry. Now, so when I think about it, I really think about community marketing being at the heart of all of this. And I heard someone describe Web3 marketing as moving away from X and Y deployment of a marketing campaign to it actually looking more like a self-marketing system. So my question is, thoughts on the framework of thinking about it in a self-marketing system way? And 2, as you know, working for a large organization and for many of you here today, the thought of having your community drive the narrative is relatively daunting, right? So how do you strike that balance between helping guide a narrative and allowing your community to kind of just take it and run with it and actively participate?
So in general, I would say that the user-generated narrative is already the dominant narrative in the internet, even in Web 2. The only difference is where is the value shared. That's the difference between Web 2 and Web 3. Facebook, Google, the top games in the world are Roblox and Minecraft, not Fortnite. What do they all have in common? User-generated content. So the value is already entirely generated by the users. But what the platforms in Web 2 have been able to do, because of the fact that there was no blockchain at the time and because of data being a proprietary asset, they've been able to farm all that data into their networks. And over the decades, basically, we've become accustomed to the idea that basically data is worthless to us somehow, but it's worth a lot to them. And then they generate value, and then they basically sell it back to us in the form of advertising, for instance, right? But even for you as marketeers, you don't actually have access to the customers anymore. There was a time where, as marketeers, you were able to reach the customer directly. You had a relationship with them, or if you were the platform, or if you were the brand, that relationship belonged to you. And then you used Facebook login, and then you gave them through groups and marketing your customer assets. And next thing you know, they charge you back money so you can re-advertise back to your own customer base. Essentially, we've all been digitally colonized. And that's basically the problem we have. So it's not just something, I think the point is that the value is already there. Community, the power of community and the value of community is already there. It's just harnessed in the wrong hands. Now, when you basically go into decentralization, what happens is you have new network effects that can build on top. Every time you have permission network effects, the network effects are limited. Imagine if someone wanted to build a new innovation on your car or your phone, and they had to go to Apple and say, am I allowed to build a case for the phone? Or can I please do this for the phone? Or can I create tires? Or am I allowed to make a baby seat for my car? That's the world of Web 2. You can't actually freely innovate. But when it becomes decentralized, when the interoperability on this is free, as in anyone can build anything on top if they wanted to, the network effect has become unlimited. Imagination becomes unlimited. And you have thousands and thousands and thousands of new businesses and network effects and applications built on top of it, which adds more value. But it does take away power from the platform. The platform no longer can sort of manage and control it. And these platforms, as they become monopolies, have a great preference, basically, in even though they might not maximize the value, they maximize the value just to themselves because the share of that value only has to go to a very small portion of people. As opposed to, in the Web3 paradigm, you need to make enough value so that you can share it across the entire ecosystem, which is a different challenge. And I think it's only possible if you decentralize it. I'll give you sort of a blockchain parallel. If Bitcoin was actually really owned by one entity, if they controlled the supply, what is the value of Bitcoin? 0. Because you know it can be taken away from you at any time. The value of Bitcoin, whatever it is, $25,000, $30,000, the dominant share of its trillion-dollar market cap, comes from the fact that you know it's untamperable, that its democratic framework does not allow you from basically stealing something that is yours, right? It's also the reason why countries that have strong democratic and property rights frameworks have more value because you can trust and invest in that as opposed to the kind of countries where you know you could lose your property anytime.
So I want to talk about data, right? Because as marketers, as you rightly said, and I think the previous TikTok speaker kind of alluded to it, we are kind of handcuffed to the data. Now, it's daunting for many of us who are working in marketing to potentially work in the future with little to no data. What are the key metrics or indicators that you look for when it comes to measuring the health of a Web3 community?
Well, one of the nice things about Web3 is that everything is on-chain. So you can basically measure the results. You go to something like Dune Analytics, you can actually see it's a public dashboard of all the chain activity around the world. You can run basic analysis and see what people are doing. This is actually quite powerful in the transparency framework. I mean, imagine if Facebook or Amazon or Google actually had a public dashboard that you could query at any time and take a look at and learn from and see what the customers were. One example, for instance, how Web3 marketing is different from Web2, which is what you kind of see with the marketplace frameworks, is because the customer information is public. You may not know their name, but you know what they purchased. You can very easily target, for instance, everyone who might have bought a Razer mouse or everyone who bought a certain kind of sort of phone, because you can say, anyone who bought an iPhone on Amazon, I'll give you basically a voucher to buy a Samsung phone. I mean, that would be an example, for instance. You can do that because you can absolutely verify that the person purchased it because Web3 and blockchain shows what they purchased. It's a real Bored Ape. It's not a fake Bored Ape because of the hash address. That sort of authenticity makes it absolutely possible to do that. And so we look at these metrics basically on-chain analysis. Data, the speed of blockchain, which is often being criticized, only allows you right now to really effectively measure the ownership. But really, just like back in the early days of the internet, databases were slow. On-chain transactions and blockchain will be much faster as well. Everything will start going on-chain. So all your transactions, what you do, will be on-chain. That means you can now add value layers on top of it, as opposed to basically giving all that value to the centralized platforms.
And just for potentially any non-tech people in the room, how I understand it is that actually in the Web3 world, there is actually more data. However, it is anonymous and it's kind of tied to your wallet, right? So instead of it being tied to my name on Facebook or another platform, actually that data is then tied to my wallet.
Well, exactly. So a little bit like that, but also there's this concept that makes blockchain work, which is called zero knowledge proof. And basically what, in a very simple nutshell, what zero knowledge proof does, it's the cryptographic equivalent of being able to get selected pieces of data of a person without never, ever really revealing sort of everything about that user. So that means that, for instance, in a sort of digital identity framework that uses blockchain, I might be accessing the framework of that user, but I only need to know the age of that user. But I know that that user is a real user without ever knowing his name or his nationality or his background or whether he's married or what he did in the last year. Whereas in the Web2 paradigm, that's not possible, or the data is basically centralized, which means why it's also not easily to be openly composable. Because if Facebook were to be okay to open up all this data, it would have all sorts of issues because you would know everything about everyone, which of course is impossible as well. And again, this is why blockchain and cryptography work so well.
And I mean, let's get to the a heart of the issue that I know. When I told a few people that I was talking to you, they were like, ask him when Web3 is going to become mainstream. Like, what timelines are we looking for? Because a lot of the counter argument is, it's a tiny community on there. I'm not going to put the time, investment, and resources against marketing to this tiny community. So thoughts on adoption rates? When are we going to see the exponential curve?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that happens in Web3 is because of the size of capital formation, is that it may be a small audience at start, but the volumes are big. At the end of the day, the ecosystem of Web3 and crypto is still $1 trillion space. I mean, if people want to say, I just want to focus on the video game industry, that happens to be 5 times smaller than the Web3 space at this moment in time. But there's a lot less users. And again, North Korea has a lot more people than Switzerland. But what's a more valuable economy? What has a lot more what has a better GDP? You don't care that you have to pay a higher cost to be in Switzerland because you have better markets, better opportunities, and actual capitalist frameworks. Whereas North Korea, that has a much larger amount of people, but nobody can make anything anyway because essentially it's all centralized and dominated in a sort of dictatorship type of way. But I think in terms of adoption, the other thing that we see as well is it's very similar, if you look at the charts, to sort of internet adoption in Web 1. And this is something that's not us, it's shared across the ecosystem if you study it. And we're kind of a little bit like Web 1, 2000, 2001 right now in terms of its adoption. And this to us, actually, the chart in the last few years has been eerily similar. So if you think about the last year and a half, we kind of think of what happened in Web 3 in the last year, a little bit like the dot-com bubble back in 2000 and 2001. So on-chain transactions, usage on the increase, values declining, speculative activity declining, is exactly the same trend. And so for us, that's why at Animoca, what we did was we looked at that and we said, well, actually, this feels like the early internet. And with the benefit of hindsight, what would we do? And that's kind of, to me, kind of like a back to the future moment where I said, well, if I had the knowledge and if I had the capital that I didn't have when I was much younger, what would I do? That's why we're investing in the ecosystem and building them out the way they do, because we think that Web3 basically is sort of growing in that manner. But the one difference is that the value formation is much, much larger. So I give you an example. The average landowner in Sandbox has, which you can see in the wallet, has a value between $500,000 to $2 million US in their wallet, right? That you can see, never mind what you can't see. So this is incredible. You see, basically, you can actually analyze the value of that community. So when people build experiences on Sandbox, they're not building experiences on Sandbox because they want to address 10 million users. They want building on Sandbox because there are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users that have a tremendous amount of value that you can go after. The other thing also is that Web3 games, for instance, you don't need 1 million users to be successful because the value, because of capital formation of each user is much higher, which is also to us like a boon for things like, like for instance, indie games or indie content creators or NFT artists who don't have to have 1 million customers or 10 million customers to be successful. Because essentially you can now really target your 1,000 true fans, right? Which is the whole sort of premise really in terms of fan engagement, but hasn't been monetizable because on the platforms, they're completely anonymized to you. You don't know who they are. Right? It's sold in terms of sort of mass numbers, when really you're only trying to target your true fans.
And I kind of want to underline here, for anyone who's new to Web3 marketing, the fundamentals of marketing don't change, right? You still need to deeply know your audience. You still need to deeply know the product.
Storytelling and all that stuff as well. Yes.
Exactly. So I just want, we've got we have zero time, but I have two quick questions, so maybe we can quickly go through them. One is, I want to link what you just said to turn the tables. We're talking about Web3 marketing. What about marketing Web3? You started your presentation with saying there are reputational challenges right now. What is it going to take to shift that?
So first of all, the reputational challenges in Web3 are predominantly a Western narrative, very US-driven, and in English-speaking markets. So you see this a bit in Australia, a little bit in Singapore, but if you go to Hong Kong, Japan, Middle East, Web3 narrative is very positive. So that's the other thing. If you're looking for a market, sort of for a more ready market, you'll find that basically sort of in places like Hong Kong or Japan, which is very sort of Web3 forward. But part of this also, I've noticed this when I was giving my TED Talk, there is a sort of bubble that we live in Web3 as well. It's not helpful that people in our community talk about Web3 and crypto and NFTs and so on when people in Web2 have no idea what that is. Also, probably we should stop referring to people in the context of Web2, Web3, because it little feels like you're old and we're new, right? That's not a positive narrative to bring people in. And I think it's something that we have to reflect on, because for Web2 users, I said it again, there is sort of this feeling that, oh yeah, you think of us in this way, right? So I think there's a little bit of that aspect that has to happen. But the main thing is that the benefits of this new internet, this Web3 internet, the idea of ownership, the idea that we should own a stake in the networks that we help construct, actually is something that people universally like. If you think about AI, for instance, AI is taking over everything. It's probably going to take a lot of the businesses that you normally used to do. What's not going to be valuable anymore is the sort of what AI can create, because that's fast. It's actually the things that are authentic, things that are truly you, and only something like blockchain can verify that.
Decoding the jargon is something that is an active foundational pillar of ours at Untamed, actually, in the community that I'm helping to build.
We don't talk about MP3s anymore, right?
Yeah, exactly. And final question, I can't leave without asking this. We talked about this when we had a quick chat on Sunday. It is the year of AI. Right, AI's had a coming out party this year. We discussed how in the Web 2 model, actually, the marketing role could quickly become redundant with increased AI and automation. So with that, how do you see, I'm interested in knowing how you see the marketing role and function shifting over time.
Generally, I wouldn't say that AI is going to replace the functions they'll replace the automatic and robotic functions, but I don't think AI is going to sort of remove the creative function or the ideation function. So sometimes we conflate the two. Like for instance, as an artist, being able to draw very, very well, is that actually what you're selling, or is it actually the story behind it, right? I mean, we can argue whether Picasso or Salvador Dali is a true creative effort in terms of its skill, shall we say. Because sometimes, some children can paint it too, but you're not buying it because someone else can copy it. You're buying it because it came from Picasso, because it was his story, or from Salvador Dali, or anyone, our artist. And the same, I think, is true for marketing. I mean, what a true strong marketer is a master storyteller. Someone who basically can touch people's feelings and basically get to people's hearts. And that's not what an AI can do. An AI can help you get there. It can sort of do it faster for you, or give you ideas, or you can spar with it. But the idea, the creativity, is still a human one.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yat. You are such a trailblazer for the Web3 industry, and just your thoughtful responses to how you see this evolving over time, I think, has influenced and inspired so many. Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause for Yat Siu. Thank you.